My name is Joseph Lario, and for my human physiology signature assignment, I went over OCD. Now, first of all, what is OCD? Well, OCD is acronymed under obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a mental health condition characterized by unwanted thoughts, including but not limited to compulsions and obsessions. Now, that's a pretty big term just because those are big umbrella blanketed terms. Let's start from the very bare, or not the bare, but as little as possible. Usually we have compulsions. Now, compulsions usually are defined by is that the repetitive behaviors of mental acts due to reduce anxiety. And they're like just small kind of things, like excessively washing your hands, cleaning, checking on something, arranging and counting, like organization. That's how we kind of see things as OCD in like a blanketed term in social medias and other platforms. We kind of welcome that in, but we don't realize that OCD also welcomes in obsessions. Now, obsessions is a little bit more of a more dangerous term, quote unquote, because this includes intrusive and unwanted thoughts. And in this presentation, I'm going to be going over the anatomy, the physiology, the pathophysiology, the demographics that affects, how we diagnose it, and how AI is actually being used today to cure OCD. Yeah. So in the anatomy, the textbook actually tells us that the orbitofrontal cortex is involved, the anterior cingulate cortex, the basal ganglia, and the thalamus. Now, the orbitofrontal cortex, this is involved in decision making, evaluating risk, and processing emotions. The anterior is involved with error detection, emotional regulation, and attention span. The basal ganglia, habit formation and movement regulation, and the thalamus is by relaying sensory and motor signals to the cortex. These are all involved because OCD basically kind of it affects the way that we want to like work things out. Like I said, with the compulsions, constantly raging something, it it makes it impossible for our prefrontal cortex to work properly if we have OCD. Now, with the actual physiology of it, in a normal feedback loop, we have two different receptors that work together to keep the homeostasis of this. First, we have glutamate, and this produces communication between neurons. Now, the glutamate is actually also known as the excitatory receptor. And so glutamate receptor receives a message to increase or decrease the transmitter to release these glutamate in order to facilitate the homeostasis. So for an example for this, since it's an excitatory one, in a high tense situation, what the body might want to do in order to keep that normal feedback loop of homeostasis, it might want to decrease the levels of glutamate that is going throughout the body in order for it to be able to calm down. In turn, we also have GABA, which reduces or inhibits the neural communication, which essentially calms the central nervous system. The GABA receptor receives the message to increase or decrease the transmitter, which is also released in order to facilitate homeostasis. So if you go back to our example of someone who has a high tense situation, what they might want to do is increase the GABA levels just because that they might be too low and they might want to increase it. That way, the person themselves feel a little bit more calm. However, the reason why we have some have OCD is because there's an actual chemical imbalance. That's the pathophysiology of OCD. There's a chemical imbalance between glutamate and GABA in the brain regions. This imbalance makes it so much harder for those with difficulty with communication skills. And it can also lead to symptoms specifically as the compulsive and intrusive thoughts. And because of these chemical imbalances, overall, what we do see different from the brain from a normal one without OCD is that there's a hyperactivity, which makes sense because how we see OCD, we see them a little bit more, anxious, fidgety a little bit, because that's just because they have a chemical imbalance that creates that hyperactivity in the brain. Now, OCD can actually affect almost everybody. There's no given like set like, oh, only this gender has it, only this certain location might get it. It can happen almost on all different sides. At any age, it can start in childhood, but often we don't really see this until late childhood and even into young adulthood. And as well for genders, I mean, there's a slight increase in women, but we can see it in almost any gender. Race and socioeconomic demographics don't actually apply. There is a little bit slight increase if there's a history of it. So if there's a history from descendants and ancestors before, then yes, there's a chance that one might develop OCD. Behavioral factors actually do play a key role in this, like including temperamental traits and stress can increase the chances of developing OCD. And morality rate itself doesn't really increase the chances due to having OCD. The only way that OCD can really play a factor is if they might act on compulsive thoughts through self-harm. Now, we can't actually test, there is no defined test for OCD. However, there is a set criteria that most professionals actually use in order to see if they have similar symptoms of those of OCD. This includes having those obsessions, compulsions, or even both of them at the same time. And those obsessions slash compulsions take up an excessive amount of time, like an unhealthy amount. And it causes distress or affects the participants in any negative way, and it affects their other personal lifestyle or even work style as well. We also need to make sure that we put a defining line that this is happening from this disorder and it's not from substances such as alcohol, drug use, or anything such as that, or medical conditions. As well as this, we got to make sure that these symptoms aren't coming from a different disorder as well, because it could be mixed between the lines as general anxiety, eating, or body image as well. Which is really cool about sorry, I know my face is in the way, but which is really cool about AI today. We can actually use artificial intelligence to be able to diagnose and maybe even implement even better resources for those with OCD. But a study from UCLA is that they used a functional MRI machine, fMRI, and they basically scanned the brains of 42 people who were diagnosed with OCD. They studied their brain neural activity, and what they did is they put this into a computer program, and it learned the common patterns of the brain activity with those who were diagnosed with OCD. And they basically proofread the computer by putting it through a new test where they would see if the program could tell who had OCD. And not only was it successful in diagnosing OCD, it was also able to then put into determination the effectiveness of certain treatments for certain patients as well. So yeah, here's my reference pages, and thank you for listening.